Cherubs, if you've ever been to Florence to see the statue of David, then you are well aware of the power of that statue. And you've also hopefully seen that TED Ed animation that I wrote, right? And perhaps you even saw the far less popular video that I made for this channel comparing it to Bernini's statue of David. Well, if you haven't, then you can watch them right after you watch this video. I'll link to them in the description below. If you have been lucky enough to see the David in person, then you also, no doubt, took note of those statues that line the gallery approaching the statue. They are a series of unfinished sculptures, figures that seem to be breaking out of the rock that contains them. The chisel marks left by Michelangelo about 500 years ago are still visible. They're unfinished and imperfect, but they're also an unexpected surprise for many visitors because they're powerful works of art on their own, despite being far less visible in our popular culture compared to the David. You'll hear them referred to collectively as the slave sculptures, and there's good reason for that name. These sculptures were intended for a large tomb for Pope Julius II, an early patron of Michelangelo. Julius, though, called Michelangelo away to other projects, like the painting of the Sistine Chapel. So these sculptures are left unfinished. Forever. I should note here that he did finish 2 of them, though. These sculptures, which are intended to be part of that tomb as well, currently live at the Louvre in Paris. As with everything Michelangelo did, they're layered in meaning. They represent the provinces controlled by Julius in his lifetime, but, and this is the interpretation that I prefer, they're also an allegory of the arts, dying and being held captive after the death of their great patron. The life of Julius, with all his patronage, these sculptures seem to say, set the arts free, and with his death, the arts are back in chains. The other finished sculptures associated with this tomb, like the magnificent statue of Moses, are, well, at his tomb in Rome. So not only are these slave sculptures in Florence unfinished, they're also out of context. Unfinished and out of context, and they're still breathtaking. They still make me feel something. They're still art. Indeed, I might go so far as to say that they're great art. They fit many of the definitions of art that I like for example, Arthur Danto's idea of art being embodied meaning. They were originally meant to be slaves, and they are, just in a different way than was intended. They're imprisoned by the rock around them, and they will be forever slaves to that circumstance. That's embodied meaning. So he successfully created an enduring work of art without actually finishing it. I want to explore how something like that can happen. How can an artist walk away from a project, leaving it unfinished, and 500 years later, the product can sit on a pedestal in a museum, fulfilling our expectation of a work of art? When you sit in that gallery and look at these sculptures, you're not only struck by the content of the human form struggling to break free from rock, you also contemplate the process of the greatest artist who's ever lived. You can see his chisel marks and cannot help but imagine the tortured and temperamental genius in his state of creative concentration trying to free these forms from the rock that imprisons them. As I'm saying this, I'm reminded of my favorite quote from Ze Frank, the greatest artist of the 21st century.
Let me not think of my work only as a stepping stone to something else. And if it is, let me become fascinated with the shape of the stone.
Being drawn in by the shape of these stones, we end up contemplating and falling in love with the process. So much of our lives is focused on the end result of things, but sitting in that gallery, you realize that so much of our lives happens in the process. So maybe art appreciation should focus less on the artifact and more on the action of art. This is, of course, already true of a lot of art. The New York School of Artists in the middle of the 20th century focused largely on the process and the display of an action upon a canvas. Most famously, Jackson Pollock's drip paintings are an action performed on a canvas, and the artifact, though engaging on its own, is consciously an artifact of that process. There's also Klein's Big Blue Anthropometry, which uses nude models as a kind of brush. The art here is the process, it's the action. The resulting paper with a blue form is simply an artifact left by the action performed on it. So let's examine this idea, that art is an activity rather than a product, by looking outside of the Western tradition. The sand mandalas of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition come to mind as a demonstration of a similar philosophy. In that case, the product is gathered up and washed away in a river, which forces the participant to focus on the process since there ultimately will be no product. I guess that's true of all art if we travel far enough into the future. Ultimately, it'll all be gone. I think I just made myself sad. I guess that's the question here. Should that make me sad? I mean, the very idea of taking a painting and hanging it on a wall for posterity doesn't even exist in most non-Western traditions. In many indigenous cultures, like the Inuit or Navajo, the act of creation is the central part of the aesthetic philosophy. The act itself is what lifts the human spirit, not just the product. Actually, I don't even need to go outside of the Western tradition to make this point. All performance art, like dance or theater, up until less than 100 years ago, had no lasting product. We needed film for that. Think about all those Greek plays we know were performed, but we have no transcript for. They still had an influence. The performances were still art. They still left a mark on civilization, or we wouldn't know that they even happened. Oh, and all music up until 100 years ago as well. There was no product. There was just the act. A song was sung, and then it was gone. A beautiful voice could not be recorded. So there's a reason why we're attracted to those unfinished slave sculptures in Florence, and there's a reason we're attracted to Jackson Pollock paintings, and a reason that we're enthralled with pointillism. And there's a reason I like to stand so close to Vermeer paintings in order to see the brushstrokes, and that has the unintended consequence of making museum guards uncomfortable. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that you should go out and create something today. It doesn't matter what the product is. The product doesn't matter. It's the process that provides value for you and to those around you. And as you're making that something, let yourself enjoy the struggle. Enjoy the process, because that's where the art is. Okay, if you liked this video, please consider subscribing. If you really liked this video, then you can check out my Patreon page using the link below. Thank you for watching.